The silence in the room was absolute until the metal met the metal with a dull and heavy clunk. A bright and unearthly blue flash filled the small laboratory and illuminated the faces of the 7 men standing in a semicircle. Slotin felt a sudden and intense wave of heat wash over his skin, as if a furnace door had been thrown open directly in front of him. At the same time, a sharp and metallic sour taste flooded his mouth as the radiation tore through his physical being at the speed of light. He did not scream, but instead he used his bare left hand to rip the heavy beryllium hemisphere away from the core and throw it across the floor. The blue glow vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a room filled with the smell of ionized air and the terrified realization of what had just happened. Louis looked at his colleagues and told them to mark their exact positions on the floor with chalk, because he knew that their lives now depended on the math of where they stood. He knew in that single second that he was already a dead man walking. 2-kilogram sphere of plutonium that was originally intended to be the heart of a third atomic bomb. This sphere was a smooth and heavy ball of silver-colored metal that felt strangely warm to the touch because of its own radioactive decay. The experiment Harry was performing was called tickling the tail of the dragon because it required him to bring the core to the very edge of a nuclear chain reaction. He was building a wall of heavy tungsten carbide bricks around the plutonium sphere to reflect neutrons back into the center of the mass. On the night of August 21st, 1945, Harry was working completely alone, which was a direct violation of the standing safety protocols. He was carefully placing the final brick when the monitoring equipment began to chatter with a frantic and rapid series of clicks. Harry realized that the next brick would push the core into a state of criticality, and he began to pull his hand back to stop the process. In that moment of hesitation, the heavy brick slipped from his fingers and tumbled directly onto the top of the plutonium sphere. The room was instantly flooded with a brilliant flash of blue light as the core went supercritical and released a massive burst of neutron radiation. Harry reached into the invisible fire and knocked the brick away with his bare hand, but the damage to his body was already total and irreversible. He walked out of the laboratory and into the cool desert air, but he could already feel the internal heat beginning to cook his tissues from the inside out. Harry Daghlian would spend the next 25 days in a hospital bed, watching his skin blister and his internal organs fail before he finally passed away. The plutonium sphere was given a new name after this tragedy, and the scientists began to whisper about it in the hallways of Los Alamos. They called it the Demon Core. Despite the death of a colleague, the pressure to understand nuclear physics meant that the experiments on the Demon Core did not stop. A man named Slotin took over the role of criticality investigator, and he was known for a style that bordered on reckless bravado. Louis was a veteran of the Manhattan Project and had even helped assemble the very first atomic bomb used at the Trinity test site. He preferred to wear blue jeans and cowboy boots while he worked, and he often ignored the formal safety devices designed to keep the scientists at a distance. The standard procedure required the use of mechanical shims to keep the two halves of the outer shell from closing completely. Louis decided that he did not need the shims, and instead he used a simple flathead screwdriver to hold the gap open by hand. He would slowly lower the top hemisphere and listen to the Geiger counter as the gap narrowed to just a fraction of an inch. On the afternoon of May 21st, 1946, Louis invited 7 of his colleagues into the laboratory to watch him perform the ritual. He was holding the upper shell with his left thumb through a hole in the top, while his right hand manipulated the tip of the screwdriver. The room was quiet as the scientists leaned in to watch the man who was considered the most experienced expert in the field. The screwdriver was the only thing preventing the Demon Core from reaching its lethal limit and ending the lives of everyone in the building. Louis was calm and steady as he twisted the tool to narrow the opening, but the heavy metal shell the screwdriver lost its purchase and slid free from between the two halves of the beryllium shield. The upper hemisphere fell with the full force of gravity and sealed the plutonium core inside a perfect reflecting chamber. The dragon had been bitten again. The blue flash was brighter and more violent than the one that had killed Harry Daghlian, and it signaled the beginning of a disaster that could never be reversed. Louis acted with a level of speed that was born from pure instinct and a desperate need to save the men standing behind him. He knew the radiation was already tearing through the cells of his body, but he did not pull away to save himself. Instead, he reached forward with his bare hand and physically ripped the assembly apart before the runaway nuclear reaction could continue. The experiment lasted less than a second, but the invisible damage had already been done. Louis stood at the center of the laboratory with a sour metallic taste in his mouth and a burning sensation spreading through his left hand. He turned to his colleague Alvin Graves and quietly apologized because he knew they were all now trapped inside the mathematics of radiation exposure. The men stumbled out into the bright sunlight of New Mexico while the radiation alarms continued screaming behind them in the laboratory. They stood together in stunned silence on the gravel path outside the Omega site, trying to understand how they were still alive. Louis reached into his pocket and removed a handful of loose coins before placing them on a nearby surface. When the radiation counters were moved close to the metal, they erupted into frantic mechanical clicking. The silver and copper in their pockets had become radioactive during the flash. The realization sent a wave of fear through the group because it meant the air itself had briefly become a weapon. as doctors began examining his skin and taking blood samples. He understood exactly what was happening inside his body because he knew the science better than almost anyone alive at that time. The radiation was acting like billions of invisible fragments tearing through the instructions that kept his cells alive. Within only a few hours, the first symptoms began to appear. A deep and violent nausea settled into his stomach, while an overwhelming exhaustion spread through his limbs. His left hand began to swell and darken as the tissue slowly died beneath the surface. The pain started as a dull heat, but soon became a relentless burning sensation that no amount of ice could soothe. Despite the agony, Louis continued helping the medical team calculate the exact radiation dose each man had received. The chalk marks on the laboratory floor became the difference between survival and death. Distance from the core was now the only thing that mattered. During the long hours of the night, Louis began seeing flashes of blue light even when his eyes were closed. The doctors realized that particles from the radiation burst were striking the nerves inside his retinas. The demon core was still with him in the darkness. By the second day, the swelling had spread up his arm, and large, waxy blisters formed across his skin. His white blood cell count began collapsing toward zero as his bone marrow was effectively sterilized by the neutron exposure. Without those cells, his body could no longer defend itself from even the smallest infections. The doctors the scientific record. Even while his body failed, he remained focused on the mechanics of the accident and replayed the fatal slip of the screwdriver over and over in his mind. The other 7 men who had stood inside the laboratory were isolated in separate rooms where they waited in fear for symptoms to emerge. Had absorbed a severe dose himself, but Louis' body had shielded him from the worst of the exposure. A few inches of distance had changed everything. By the 5th day, Louis' condition deteriorated rapidly. Radiation had destroyed the lining of his intestines, which meant his body could no longer properly absorb water or nutrients. He began losing weight at a terrifying speed, while his skin took on a pale, translucent appearance like old parchment. The man who had once walked confidently into the laboratory wearing cowboy boots and blue jeans was now a fragile figure held together by morphine and medical tape. The burning sensation inside his hand became almost unbearable. Nurses packed it in ice, but the relief never lasted. He told his parents that he was simply going through a difficult period, but deep down he knew there would be no recovery. His organs were beginning to fail one by one as the invisible destruction spread through his body. Outside the hospital, the desert nights remained silent, and still while inside the ward, Louis' body fought a battle it could never win. At Los Alamos, the accidents forced the scientific community into a moment of reckoning. Researchers finally accepted that the manual methods used during criticality testing were far too dangerous to continue. The demon core itself was moved into secure storage where it sat alone in darkness, waiting for as though it were cursed. The fear surrounding the core deepened with every passing day that Louis remained alive. By the 8th day, his body had entered the final stages of catastrophic radiation poisoning. His organs were shutting down while large sections of skin peeled away from his body. The doctors stood helplessly beside the bed because there was nothing left they could do to stop the damage. Even then, Louis remained remarkably lucid at times and continued speaking calmly with the researchers around him. He understood that his death would forever change the safety procedures surrounding nuclear experimentation. The era of scientists using their bare hands to balance the edge of a chain reaction was coming to an end. On May 30th, 1946, Louis Slotin passed away surrounded by colleagues who had watched him save their lives inside that laboratory. The news spread rapidly through the scientific community and shocked everyone connected to the Manhattan Project. The death of Harry Daghlian had been seen as a terrible accident. The death of Louis Slotin proved the entire approach to criticality testing had to change. From that moment onward, remote controlled equipment and strict safety barriers became standard procedure. The demon core itself was eventually melted down and recycled into other nuclear weapons. The original sphere ceased to exist, but its story survived. The men who had witnessed the blue flash carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. Survived the accident, but continued suffering health complications and vision problems for many years afterward. eureka sight eventually fell silent as the world entered the long and fearful years of the Cold War. The story of the Demon Core became a warning whispered through laboratories and lecture halls whenever scientists spoke about the dangers of invisible forces. Harry Daghlian and Slotin were not soldiers killed in battle. Pioneers standing at the edge of human knowledge, where a single mistake could unleash the power of the sun itself. Their deaths forced the scientific world to confront a terrifying truth. There is no room for arrogance when dealing with forces that exist beyond ordinary human understanding. The Demon Core waited patiently for only the smallest slip of the hand, and when that moment arrived, it struck without mercy. If you found yourself gripped by this investigation into the Demon Core and the terrifying reality of the blue flash, I want to welcome you to join us again for more. There are countless mysteries buried in the archives of history that are still waiting to be uncovered, and I would love for you to be part of that journey. By clicking the like button and subscribing to Hushed History, you help ensure that these stories continue reaching those who seek the truth hidden within the shadows of the past. Take a moment now to relax and allow the weight of the day to slowly drift away as you prepare for a deep and peaceful rest. I will be here waiting with another mystery when you are ready to listen again. Until next time, stay curious curious and sleep well.